Lieutenant General George Kenney stood on the observation deck of his headquarters in Port Moresby, New Guinea, studying aerial reconnaissance photographs spread across the briefing table. The date was January 12th, 1944. Before him lay images of Rabaul, the fortress the Japanese had spent 2 years transforming into what they called the Gibraltar of the Pacific. The photographs showed anti-aircraft positions clustered so densely that they formed geometric patterns across the volcanic landscape. They showed underground bunkers carved into Simpson Harbor's cliffs. They showed 5 airfields, their runways crisscrossing the terrain like the strands of a spider's web. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Kenney had been ordered to neutralize Rabaul, but as he examined the intelligence reports, calculating the cost in men and aircraft, he realized something that would fundamentally change American strategy in the Pacific. Rabaul didn't need to be conquered. It only needed to be ignored. The fortress that Japan had built to be unconquerable would instead be bypassed, isolated, and left to consume itself. The garrison that had prepared for a glorious defensive battle would instead face something far worse than combat: irrelevance, followed by slow starvation. This was the central irony of fortress warfare in the age of aircraft carriers and long-range bombers. The Japanese had built Rabaul to be impregnable, and they had succeeded. They had fortified it with such thoroughness that capturing it would require months of fighting and tens of thousands of casualties. They had stockpiled ammunition enough for years of battle. They had trained their garrison to fight to the death. They had prepared for every conceivable assault scenario, but they had not prepared for the one thing that would actually happen: nothing. The Japanese commanders at Rabaul, secure in their fortifications, confident in their strategic importance, believed they were holding one of the most critical positions in the Pacific. They were partially correct. Rabaul was strategically located at the northern tip of New Britain Island, commanding the approaches to the Solomon Islands and New Guinea. It possessed one of the finest natural harbors in the Pacific, capable of sheltering dozens of ships simultaneously. It sat at a crossroads of sea and air routes that connected Japan's southern territories. But what the Japanese garrison did not yet understand, what they could not see as they drilled and trained and fortified their positions throughout early 1944, was that strategic importance and strategic necessity were not the same thing. A position could be valuable, yet not worth the cost of capturing. And more critically, in modern warfare, a position could be neutralized without ever being attacked. The Americans were about to prove that the strongest fortress could be defeated not by overwhelming it, but by making it irrelevant. This is the story of how 20,000 Japanese soldiers, sailors, and aviators transformed Rabaul into the most heavily fortified position in the South Pacific, how they prepared for a climactic battle that would prove their worth, and how they instead experienced something no military force expects. They were simply left behind. They would spend the remainder of the war not fighting, but starving, not dying in glorious combat, but succumbing to malnutrition, disease, and the slow psychological destruction of realizing they had been rendered strategically meaningless. Their fortress would remain intact, their defenses would remain impenetrable, and none of it would matter. To understand why the Japanese invested so heavily in Rabaul, one must understand the strategic situation in the Pacific as it existed in 1942. When Japanese forces captured Rabaul on January 23, 1942, they seized more than just another island position. They acquired a location that would anchor their entire defensive perimeter in the South Pacific. The town of Rabaul itself was small, a colonial administrative center that had been built by the Germans before World War I and then administered by Australia between the wars. What mattered was not the town, but the harbor. Simpson Harbor was a sunken volcanic caldera, nearly perfectly circular, protected from storms by the surrounding crater walls, deep enough to accommodate any vessel in the Japanese fleet. The harbor could shelter cruisers, destroyers, submarines, and support vessels simultaneously while remaining largely hidden from aerial observation. The surrounding terrain offered additional advantages. The volcanic landscape provided natural defensive positions. Ridges commanded fields of fire. Caves and ravines offered ready-made shelter that could be expanded into bunkers and storage facilities. The soil, though challenging for construction, was firm enough to support heavy fortifications once properly prepared. Japanese military doctrine in 1942 emphasized holding key positions in depth. The concept was to create strong points that would serve multiple purposes simultaneously. They would be forward airfields from which to strike at Allied positions, naval anchorages from which to launch fleet operations, supply depots to support offensive operations deeper into the Pacific, and, if necessary, fortresses that would consume enemy resources and time if attacked directly. Rabaul embodied this doctrine perfectly. Within months of its capture, Japanese engineers began construction work on a scale rarely seen in the Pacific theater. They built 5 separate airfields around the town: Lakunai, Vunakanau, Rapopo, Tobera, and Keravat. Each airfield required leveling terrain, laying runway surfaces, constructing revetments for aircraft protection, and building fuel storage and ammunition dumps. The work consumed thousands of laborers, both Japanese military engineers and local civilians pressed into service. Underground facilities expanded constantly throughout 1942 and 1943. Engineers carved tunnels into the volcanic rock surrounding Simpson Harbor. These tunnels served as command posts, hospitals, ammunition magazines, and living quarters. Some tunnels extended hundreds of yards into the hillsides, with multiple entrances and interconnecting passages. The volcanic rock, once excavated, required minimal shoring. It was naturally resistant to collapse even under bombardment. Anti-aircraft defenses grew with each passing month. The Japanese installed hundreds of anti-aircraft guns around Rabaul, ranging from 25mm automatic weapons to 127mm heavy anti-aircraft guns. These weapons were positioned to provide overlapping fields of fire, creating zones where attacking aircraft would face near-continuous anti-aircraft fire, regardless of their approach direction. Gun crews trained constantly, developing the fire discipline and coordination necessary to create effective anti-aircraft barrages. By early 1943, Rabaul had become the most heavily defended position in the South Pacific, perhaps in the entire Pacific theater, outside the Japanese home islands. The garrison numbered over 90,000 men, including combat troops, air crews, naval personnel, and support staff. The total would eventually exceed 100,000, but even in early 1943, Rabaul represented a concentration of Japanese military power that could not be ignored. The Japanese commanders at Rabaul understood their strategic value. They received regular reports of Allied movements in the Solomon Islands and New Guinea. They understood that any Allied advance toward the Philippines or toward Japan itself would have to contend with Rabaul. Their position was not merely defensive. It was a dagger pointed at Allied supply lines and advance routes. They believed, with considerable justification based on available evidence, that they were holding one of the war's critical positions. The men who garrisoned Rabaul were not merely soldiers occupying a position. They were builders of what they believed would be an impregnable bastion. The construction efforts that transformed Rabaul into a fortress complex consumed years of labor and represented a massive investment of resources that Japan could barely afford to make. Vice Admiral Junichi Kusaka arrived to take command of Southeast Area Fleet Headquarters at Rabaul in April 1943. He found a base that was already formidable but recognized it needed to become even stronger. Under his direction, fortification efforts intensified. Engineers carved additional tunnels into the surrounding hills. Concrete reinforced the most critical facilities. Camouflage netting and vegetation concealment made installations harder to identify from the air. The anti-aircraft defenses continued expanding throughout 1943. Japanese doctrine called for anti-aircraft guns to be positioned in mutually supporting positions, with overlapping fields of fire creating killing zones for attacking aircraft. Around Rabaul, this doctrine was implemented with unusual thoroughness. Gun positions ringed every major installation. Searchlight batteries were positioned to illuminate night attackers. Fire control centers coordinated defensive fire, directing multiple gun batteries against single targets when necessary. Japanese fighter aircraft operated from Rabaul's 5 airfields in rotation, maintaining combat air patrols above the base during daylight hours. The fighters, primarily Mitsubishi A6M Zeros, represented Japan's best air defense capability. Pilots who served at Rabaul during this period included some of the Imperial Japanese Navy's most experienced aviators, men who had fought since the war's beginning and survived hundreds of combat sorties. The naval facilities at Simpson Harbor expanded to accommodate the fleet units that operated from Rabaul. Repair facilities were constructed, allowing damaged vessels to be serviced without returning to Japan. Fuel storage tanks held thousands of tons of oil, enough to support extended fleet operations. Ammunition magazines stored torpedoes, shells, and bombs. The harbor became not just an anchorage, but a fully functional naval base capable of supporting major fleet operations. Supply stockpiles grew throughout 1943. Warehouses held food sufficient to feed the garrison for months. Ammunition dumps contained millions of rounds of small arms ammunition, thousands of artillery shells, and vast quantities of anti-aircraft ammunition. Medical supplies filled storage facilities carved into the hillsides. The quartermaster's inventory listed every item necessary to sustain a large military force for an extended period. The garrison's composition reflected Rabaul's importance. Combat infantry divisions were stationed in defensive positions around the base perimeter. Artillery battalions occupied positions commanding the approaches to the harbor and airfields. Naval infantry units, specially trained for base defense, manned the coastal defense batteries. Airbase personnel maintained the constant flow of aircraft operations. Support troops handled logistics, medical services, and administration. Japanese propaganda presented Rabaul as an unsinkable aircraft carrier, a fortress that would anchor the empire's defensive perimeter and serve as a springboard for future offensive operations. Newspapers in Japan published articles describing the base's strength. Radio broadcasts praised the garrison's determination. The psychological message was clear. Rabaul was impregnable. Its defenders were prepared for any challenge, and the Americans would break themselves against its defenses if they dared to attack. The garrison believed this message. They had reason to believe it. They could see the fortifications they had built. They trained constantly in defensive operations. They conducted exercises simulating American assaults, practicing the coordination between artillery, infantry, and anti-aircraft units that would be necessary to defeat an invasion. They studied reports from other Pacific battles, learning from Japanese defeats elsewhere, and incorporating those lessons into their defensive plans. In early 1944, as Lieutenant General Kenney studied his reconnaissance photographs in New Guinea, the Japanese garrison at Rabaul waited with confidence born from 2 years of preparation. They were ready for battle. They would get something entirely different. The strategic decision to bypass Rabaul did not emerge suddenly. It evolved through months of debate among Allied commanders who were reassessing fundamental assumptions about Pacific warfare. The question before them was deceptively simple. Must every Japanese strongpoint be captured, or could some be neutralized through isolation? Admiral William Halsey, commanding the South Pacific area, had initially planned to assault Rabaul directly. Preliminary plans called for a multi-division amphibious assault supported by naval bombardment and sustained air attacks. Staff officers calculated that capturing Rabaul would require at least 3 divisions, possibly 4, with casualties potentially exceeding 10,000 men. The operation would consume months of fighting through fortified positions, underground bunkers, and prepared defensive lines. General Douglas MacArthur, commanding the Southwest Pacific area, had similar plans developed by his staff. His planners estimated even higher casualties, noting that Rabaul's terrain favored the defender and that Japanese doctrine emphasized fighting to the death rather than surrendering. The jungle-covered hills, the interlocking defensive positions, and the vast underground tunnel networks would make every yard of advance costly. But as Allied forces advanced through the Solomon Islands and along New Guinea's northern coast during 1943, a different possibility emerged. Aircraft carriers could project power across vast distances without requiring land bases directly adjacent to enemy positions. Long-range bombers could strike targets hundreds of miles away. Supply ships could deliver materials to forward bases without passing through waters dominated by enemy strongpoints. The old assumption that every enemy base along an advance route must be captured was no longer necessarily true. Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, received proposals from his planning staff suggesting that Rabaul could be isolated rather than assaulted. The proposals noted that if Allied forces established bases north and west of Rabaul, the fortress would be cut off from reinforcement and supply. Aircraft operating from these new bases could prevent Japanese ships from reaching Rabaul and could suppress any Japanese air operations from the base. The strategic logic was compelling. Rabaul's strength lay in its position as a forward base from which Japan could project power. If that power projection capability could be neutralized through isolation, Rabaul would become strategically irrelevant, regardless of how heavily it was fortified. The garrison might number 100,000 men, but those men could do nothing if they were trapped on an island with no way to affect the war's outcome. Lieutenant General George Kenney, commanding Allied air forces in the Southwest Pacific, championed the bypass strategy with particular enthusiasm. His bomber crews had been striking Rabaul since October 1943, and he knew the cost in aircraft and aircrews. Rabaul's anti-aircraft defenses destroyed or damaged dozens of Allied aircraft during every major raid. Kenney calculated that an extended air campaign to suppress Rabaul's defenses in preparation for an amphibious assault would cost hundreds of aircraft and thousands of aircrews. Instead, Kenney proposed maintaining constant air pressure on Rabaul while establishing new bases that would allow Allied forces to advance beyond it. His aircraft could bomb Rabaul regularly enough to prevent the Japanese from using it offensively, while consuming far fewer resources than would be required for a full-scale assault. The garrison could be left to wither on the vine, a phrase that would become associated with the strategy. The Joint Chiefs of Staff in Washington reviewed the proposals in late 1943. The decision represented a fundamental shift in strategic thinking. Rather than viewing the Pacific advance as a series of sequential captures of Japanese positions, planners began to see the advance as a selective operation where only strategically necessary positions would be assaulted. Others would be bypassed, isolated, and rendered irrelevant through naval and air supremacy. On December 20th, 1943, the decision was formalized. Rabaul would not be assaulted. Instead, Allied forces would establish bases on Cape Gloucester, the Green Islands, and eventually Emirau Island, creating an arc of positions that would isolate Rabaul from reinforcement and supply. The Japanese garrison at Rabaul first noticed changes in Allied bombing patterns in late January 1944. The raids continued with their usual intensity, hundreds of bombers escorted by fighters striking the airfields and harbor facilities. But the targets began to shift. Instead of systematic attacks aimed at destroying Rabaul's capacity to function, the raids seemed designed to harass and suppress rather than eliminate. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Admiral Kusaka, studying intelligence reports in his underground command post, noted Allied amphibious operations on Cape Gloucester at the western tip of New Britain Island. The landing on December the 26th, 1943, had established an American presence less than 300 miles from Rabaul. Japanese aircraft from Rabaul attempted to strike the landing forces but encountered overwhelming fighter opposition. The losses were severe. 28 Japanese aircraft shot down in exchange for minimal Allied casualties. More concerning was what Cape Gloucester represented strategically. The Americans had not attempted to advance from Cape Gloucester toward Rabaul. Instead, they consolidated their position, built up supplies, and constructed airfields. They were not preparing to attack Rabaul from the west. They were simply establishing a base that cut the supply route between Rabaul and Japanese forces further west in New Guinea. On February 15, 1944, Allied forces landed on the Green Islands, approximately 120 miles east of Rabaul. The Japanese garrison at Rabaul prepared to counterattack, but orders from higher command directed them to conserve their strength. The reasoning became clear within days. There would be no opportunity to mount a significant counterattack. Allied air superiority over the Green Islands was absolute. Any Japanese naval force attempting to approach would be destroyed by air attack before reaching the target. The pattern continued on March 20, 1944, when Allied forces landed on Rabaul Island in the St. Matthias Group, approximately 200 miles northwest of Rabaul. Again, Japanese forces prepared for action. Again, they received orders to hold position. Again, Allied air power prevented any effective response. Admiral Kusaka convened his senior staff officers in early April 1944 to assess the situation. The discussion, recorded in after-action reports compiled after the war, revealed the garrison's growing understanding of their predicament. They had not been attacked because they would not be attacked. The Americans had bypassed them. One staff officer pointed out the obvious implication. Rabaul was now surrounded by Allied bases. Cape Gloucester controlled the western approaches. The Green Islands controlled the eastern approaches. Rabaul controlled the northern approaches. Supply ships attempting to reach Rabaul would have to pass through waters within range of Allied aircraft operating from all three bases. The garrison had stockpiles sufficient for perhaps 6 months of full operations, possibly longer if consumption was reduced, but those stockpiles would eventually be exhausted. Fresh food supplies were already running low, forcing increased reliance on rice and canned goods. Medical supplies were adequate for current needs, but could not be replaced once consumed. Ammunition was plentiful, but ammunition was useful only if there was someone to shoot at. The psychological impact on the garrison was profound, but initially subtle. The men had prepared for battle. They had trained for defensive operations against an amphibious assault. They had studied tactics, positioned weapons, and prepared firing plans. Every man knew his role in the coming battle. They were ready. But there would be no battle. Instead, there was waiting. Daily bombing raids continued, requiring constant manning of anti-aircraft positions and maintenance of air defenses. But the raids were not preparation for an assault. They were simply punishment, a means of keeping the garrison suppressed and preventing any Japanese use of Rabaul's airfields or harbor facilities. The Imperial Japanese Navy withdrew its major surface units from Rabaul in late February 1944. Heavy cruisers, light cruisers, and destroyers that had operated from Simpson Harbor returned to Truk Atoll in the Caroline Islands. The withdrawal was not announced to the garrison, but it was impossible to conceal. Sailors watched their ships depart, knowing they would not return. The naval air groups also withdrew, flying their remaining aircraft to bases further north. What remained at Rabaul was a garrison stripped of offensive capability. The combat troops, the artillery batteries, the anti-aircraft guns all remained. The fortifications were intact. The ammunition stockpiles were untouched. But the means to affect the war's outcome had been removed. Rabaul had been transformed from a forward operating base into a static defensive position with no enemy to defend against. Supply ships attempted to reach Rabaul during March and April 1944, running at night to avoid Allied air patrols. Some succeeded, delivering food and ammunition. But the losses were unsustainable. Allied aircraft sank or damaged multiple supply vessels, and the Japanese Navy concluded that the losses exceeded the value of the supplies delivered. Orders went out. No more supply runs to Rabaul. The garrison would subsist on existing stockpiles and whatever food they could produce locally. The garrison's leadership attempted to maintain morale through traditional means. Daily training continued. Defensive positions were improved and expanded. New bunkers were dug. New firing positions prepared. New camouflage applied. The work kept men occupied and maintained military discipline. But it could not address the fundamental question every soldier eventually asked. What was the purpose of their continued presence at Rabaul? Japanese military culture emphasized duty, sacrifice, and loyalty to the emperor. Soldiers were taught that every position must be held, every defense maintained, every order followed regardless of personal cost. The garrison at Rabaul embodied these values. They would hold their position because they had been ordered to hold it. They would maintain their defenses because that was their duty. But human psychology requires purpose beyond mere obedience. Soldiers can endure hardship, danger, and even certain death if they believe their sacrifice serves a meaningful objective. The garrison at Rabaul faced a different challenge. Enduring hardship while knowing their presence achieved nothing of strategic value. They were not preventing an Allied advance, because the Allies had already advanced beyond them. They were not threatening Allied supply lines, because Allied air power prevented them from launching any offensive operations. They were not forcing the Allies to divert resources to contain them, because the naval and air blockade required relatively minimal ongoing commitment. Food rationing began in May 1944. The garrison's quartermasters calculated remaining supplies and determined that full rations could not be sustained indefinitely. Initial reductions were modest, barely noticeable to most soldiers. Rice portions decreased slightly. Fresh vegetables, already scarce, became rarer. Meat, which had never been plentiful, appeared only on special occasions. The Japanese command structure at Rabaul maintained regular communication with headquarters in Truk and Tokyo through submarine-delivered mail and radio transmissions. These communications emphasized the garrison's continued readiness and determination. Reports detailed ongoing defensive preparations, anti-aircraft engagements with Allied bombers, and the troops' unshakable morale. What the reports did not convey, could not convey within the constraints of military communication protocols, was the growing awareness among the garrison that they were fighting a different kind of war than they had prepared for. They had trained to defend against assault. Instead, they would defend against irrelevance. They had stockpiled ammunition for a climactic battle. Instead, they would ration rice to survive another week. They had built fortifications to protect them from enemy attack. Instead, those fortifications would become a prison from which there was no escape. By June 1944, the garrison at Rabaul understood their situation with complete clarity. The Americans had bypassed them. No relief was coming. No supplies would arrive. The fortress they had built would not be tested in battle. Instead, they would face an enemy that required no soldiers, no weapons, no tactics, time itself. The food situation deteriorated steadily throughout the summer of 1944. Rice rations, which had been reduced modestly in May, were cut again in June, then again in July. By August, soldiers received approximately 60% of the rations they had been issued at the beginning of the year. The reduction was not yet starvation, but it was sufficient to cause constant hunger, reduced energy levels, and declining physical conditioning. Quartermasters inventoried every food item in storage, calculating consumption rates against remaining supplies. Their projections were grim. At current consumption levels, existing stockpiles would be exhausted by early 1945. After that, the garrison would be entirely dependent on whatever food they could produce themselves from local resources. The command staff ordered immediate agricultural operations. Soldiers who had trained as infantrymen and artillerymen became farmers. They cleared jungle vegetation from areas around the base perimeter, creating garden plots where sweet potatoes, taro, and other crops could be grown. The volcanic soil, once properly prepared, was reasonably fertile, but crop cultivation required time and the garrison needed food immediately. Fishing operations expanded along the coastline, but Allied air patrols made daytime fishing dangerous. Boats that ventured onto the water risked being strafed by patrolling aircraft. Fishing had to be conducted at night, limiting the catch. Soldiers fashioned nets from whatever materials were available, using techniques some had learned in civilian life before the war. The fish they caught supplemented rice rations but could not replace them. Hunting parties ventured into New Britain's interior jungle, searching for wild pigs and birds. The hunting was dangerous for reasons beyond Allied aircraft. The jungle terrain was difficult, easy to become lost in, and home to various tropical diseases. Soldiers who became separated from their units sometimes disappeared entirely, either succumbing to illness, injury, or simply losing their way in the dense vegetation. The Japanese command structure attempted to maintain morale through traditional military discipline and ideological reinforcement. Officers conducted daily formations, emphasizing the importance of holding Rabaul and denying its use to the enemy. They reminded soldiers of their duty to the Emperor and to Japan. They praised the garrison's fortitude and predicted eventual relief once Japan's strategic situation improved. But soldiers living on reduced rations while performing hard labor in tropical heat were not easily inspired by abstract concepts. They needed food, and rhetoric could not fill empty stomachs. The gap between official declarations of readiness and material reality grew wider with each passing month. Medical facilities at Rabaul, which had been prepared to handle combat casualties, instead found themselves treating malnutrition-related illnesses. Beriberi, caused by thiamine deficiency, became increasingly common as the rice-heavy diet lacked essential vitamins. Soldiers developed swelling in their legs and feet, experienced difficulty breathing, and suffered from fatigue far beyond what their reduced physical exertion should have caused. Tropical diseases that had always been present at Rabaul became more severe as the garrison's overall health declined. Malaria cases increased. Dengue fever struck men whose weakened immune systems could not fight off infection effectively. Dysentery, always a concern in tropical environments with limited sanitation, became more prevalent and more deadly as soldiers' bodies lacked the nutritional reserves to recover. The irony was inescapable. The garrison possessed thousands of tons of ammunition. Their artillery pieces were maintained and ready. Their anti-aircraft guns remained operational. Their infantry weapons were clean and functional. They could fight, but they had no one to fight. They could defend, but there was no attacker to defend against. 1945 brought no improvement to Rabaul's situation. If anything, conditions deteriorated faster as the garrison consumed the last of their reserve supplies and became entirely dependent on local food production. The sweet potato gardens that had been planted in late 1944 began producing, but the yield was insufficient to feed over 100,000 men. Daily caloric intake fell below 2,000 calories per person, then below 1,500. Soldiers lost weight steadily. Physical appearance changed visibly. Men who had been healthy and well-fed when Rabaul was an active base became gaunt, their faces hollowed, their uniforms hanging loose on frames that had lost 20 or 30 pounds. Energy levels declined proportionally. Tasks that had once been routine became exhausting. The psychological impact of starvation was, in some ways, more devastating than the physical effects. Hunger dominated every waking thought. Soldiers talked constantly about food, remembering meals they had eaten before the war, describing dishes from their hometowns, fantasizing about the first meal they would eat when the war ended. The obsession with food was not a choice. It was a biological response to prolonged caloric deficit. Military discipline began to fray under the pressure of constant hunger. Theft of food became common despite harsh penalties. Soldiers stole from supply warehouses, from garden plots, from each other's rations. Officers struggled to maintain order while facing the same hunger as their men. Courts-martial were convened for food theft, but the punishments, even when severe, could not eliminate the behavior when the alternative was slow starvation. Some soldiers attempted to escape Rabaul by boat, hoping to reach Japanese-held territory elsewhere in the Pacific, or perhaps to surrender to Allied forces. Most of these attempts ended in death. Small boats were easily spotted by Allied air patrols and sunk. Even if a boat evaded detection, the distances involved were vast, the navigation difficult, and the chances of success minimal. Bodies occasionally washed ashore on New Britain's coastline, men who had attempted escape and died in the attempt. The Allied bombing raids continued throughout 1945, though with reduced frequency as Allied air resources shifted toward supporting operations closer to Japan. The raids served primarily to keep the garrison suppressed and to prevent any Japanese attempt to reactivate Rabaul's airfields. Each raid required Japanese anti-aircraft crews to man their positions, consuming energy that starving men could ill afford to expend. In March 1945, Admiral Kusaka received orders from Imperial General Headquarters, acknowledging Rabaul's isolation and authorizing the garrison to take whatever measures necessary to sustain themselves. The orders effectively conceded that no relief would be forthcoming, and that the garrison was expected to survive on local resources indefinitely. The message was clear. Hold your position, maintain discipline, and endure until the war's end, whenever that might be. The garrison's strengths, which had seemed so formidable in 1943 and early 1944, became irrelevant or even burdensome. The vast ammunition stockpiles were useless without targets. The extensive fortifications required maintenance that consumed labor while protecting against attacks that never came. The large garrison, which had been intended to make Rabaul impregnable, instead created a massive population that needed to be fed from inadequate local resources. Japanese soldiers at Rabaul watched American aircraft fly overhead, often at altitudes too high for anti-aircraft fire to reach effectively. The aircraft were not attacking Rabaul. They were simply passing by on their way to targets further north, toward the Philippines, toward Iwo Jima, toward Okinawa, toward Japan itself. The war was continuing, advancing, progressing toward its conclusion, and Rabaul played no part in it. The garrison had become what military planners call a withering asset, a force that consumed resources without affecting the strategic situation, that tied down men without contributing to the war effort, that held ground without preventing enemy advances. The war ended on August 15, 1945, when Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender in a radio broadcast. At Rabaul, the garrison received orders to cease hostilities and await Allied occupation forces. On September 6, 1945, Australian troops arrived to formally accept the garrison's surrender. What the Australians found shocked them despite their expectations. The garrison that surrendered at Rabaul numbered approximately 95,000 men, though exact figures vary depending on how one counted naval personnel, civilian laborers, and others attached to the base. Of these, fewer than 100 had died from direct combat action during the entire period of isolation, from early 1944 through September 1945. But malnutrition and disease had killed thousands. Exact mortality figures were never definitively established, because Japanese record-keeping had deteriorated during the final months. Australian medical officers estimated that at least 5,000 men had died from starvation-related causes and diseases exacerbated by malnutrition. Some estimates ran higher, suggesting 8,000 or more deaths. The survivors were systematically evacuated, processed, and eventually repatriated to Japan. Medical examinations revealed the extent of the garrison's suffering. Average weight loss exceeded 30 pounds per man. Malnutrition-related diseases were nearly universal. Many men required extended hospitalization before they were healthy enough to return home. The fortress had remained intact, the defenses had remained manned, but the garrison had been consumed from within by the simple arithmetic of insufficient food for too many men over too long a period. The strategic implications of Rabaul's bypass extended far beyond that single base. The success of the isolation strategy validated a fundamental shift in American Pacific operations. After Rabaul, similar bypasses were employed throughout the Pacific. Truk Atoll in the Caroline Islands, once considered Japan's Gibraltar of the Pacific, even more than Rabaul, was bypassed and isolated with over 40,000 troops left to garrison a base that would never be attacked. Wake Island, recaptured by Japan early in the war, was bypassed rather than recaptured, leaving its garrison isolated until war's end. The bypass strategy allowed American forces to advance toward Japan more rapidly and with fewer casualties than would have been required if every Japanese strongpoint had been assaulted directly. The strategy recognized that in modern warfare, with aircraft carriers providing mobile air power and long-range bombers capable of striking targets hundreds of miles away, geographical positions mattered less than they had in previous wars. A fortress could be made irrelevant without being destroyed. For the men who had garrisoned Rabaul, the experience left psychological scars that, for many, never fully healed. They had prepared for one kind of war and experienced another. They had built fortifications that were never tested. They had stockpiled ammunition that was never fired in anger. They had trained for a climactic battle that never came. Instead, they had slowly starved while remaining militarily capable of fighting, an irony that captured the essential tragedy of their situation. Lieutenant General Kenney's observation from January 1944, when he studied the reconnaissance photographs and realized Rabaul didn't need to be conquered, proved prophetically accurate. The fortress that Japan had built to be impregnable was defeated not by overwhelming it, but by ignoring it. The garrison that had prepared to fight to the death instead fought to survive, and thousands lost that fight without ever engaging the enemy in combat. This was modern industrial warfare in its most ruthless form, Victory achieved not through heroic assault, but through calculated isolation, not through overwhelming force, but through strategic irrelevance. Rabaul's 20,000 troops and the 75,000 others who eventually joined them learned what fortresses mean in an age of aircraft and carriers. Nothing. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out these other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.